The throne room of the Zaltharian Empire was filled with the sound of armor clashing and boots striking the marble floor. Rows of alien soldiers stood in perfect formation, their weapons glowing faintly. At the far end, the Emperor sat on a towering, black and gold throne, his many eyes scanning the grand hall with a look of impatience. His voice was sharp when he finally spoke to the ambassador standing before him. "You promised me a legion to crush the human uprising. Where is it?" The ambassador, a tall woman with tiger-like markings on her skin and golden eyes, stepped forward without fear. Her fur-trimmed armor shimmered in the warm torchlight. She bowed slightly, but her smile never faded. Every soldier in the room felt the tension in the air as her words echoed across the chamber. "I did not bring you a legion, my emperor. I brought you one human." Murmurs rippled through the gathered soldiers. Some laughed under their breath. Others looked confused. A single human against the might of an empire seemed like a cruel joke. The emperor's fingers did the armrest of his throne. His voice was cold as he leaned forward. "Explain yourself before I decide your fate." The woman turned slightly and motioned to the grand doorway behind her. From the shadows stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man. He wore simple armor without ornament. But the way he moved was different, calm, confident, and without fear. His gaze swept over the room, meeting the eyes of the alien soldiers as if weighing each one. He stopped in the center of the hall, his voice quiet but carrying easily. "My name is Kale. I'm all you'll need." Laughter broke out among the younger soldiers. They saw only flesh and blood, fragile compared to their reinforced bodies, but the veterans fell silent. Something about his stance, his eyes, and the faint scars on his skin told a different story. The emperor raised one brow, his interest piqued. Still, he waved his hand toward a group of elite guards. "Test him. Show me what makes this human worth my time." The guards stepped forward, towering over Kale. Their armor hummed with energy. They expected him to hesitate, but Kale moved first. His strike was fast, almost too fast for the eye to follow. One guard hit the floor before realizing the fight had begun. The others attacked together, but Kale moved like a predator, dodging, striking, and using their own momentum against them. Within moments, all four guards lay on the marble floor, groaning in pain. The throne room was silent now. Even the emperor leaned back, studying the human with new interest. The ambassador's smile widened. She stepped beside Kale, her voice low but meant for all to hear. "You asked for a legion to win your war. I gave you the one weapon no army can match." The emperor narrowed his eyes. "And what is that?" The woman's golden eyes locked on his. "A human who doesn't know how to lose." Kale stood silently beside her, his breathing steady, his eyes still watching every soldier in the room. He did not bow or speak again. He didn't need to. The display of skill had said more than words ever could. The younger soldiers now avoided his gaze, while the veterans studied him like a puzzle they wanted to understand. The emperor's voice broke the silence. "Very well. This human will fight for me. But if he fails, both of you will answer with your lives." The ambassador inclined her head slightly, still smiling. "Then you have nothing to fear, my emperor." Kale's lips curled into a faint smirk as he turned toward the hall's massive exit. The sound of the fallen guards groaning behind him was the only noise in the great room. Every soldier there knew they had just seen something dangerous, something the empire had not prepared for. And somewhere in the emperor's many eyes, there was not just curiosity, but a spark of something rarer. Hope. Asterisk. The next morning, the emperor's orders were delivered to Kale and the ambassador. They were to lead a small force into the borderlands, where human resistance fighters had been holding their ground against the empire's advance. Many of the emperor's generals believed it was a trap. Others thought it was a waste of resources to send such a small unit. But the emperor wanted proof of the human's worth, and he wanted it quickly. Kale stood in the training courtyard as soldiers gathered to watch. They whispered among themselves, still unsure if the events of the previous day were a trick. The ambassador walked beside him, her feline ears twitching as she caught pieces of their words. She smiled faintly, knowing that once they saw Kale in battle, their doubts would vanish. The mission began at dawn. The small force traveled in silence, led by the ambassador through winding mountain passes and dense alien forests. Kale moved at the front, scanning the terrain with sharp eyes. He spoke little, but every movement showed discipline and awareness. Even the soldiers who doubted him began to notice the way he read the land, spotting danger before anyone else did. By midday, they reached the ruins of an outpost that had been destroyed days earlier. The air smelled of smoke and blood. The ambassador knelt to examine the ground, tracing claw marks that cut deep into the stone. Kale crouched beside her, studying the patterns. "Not human work," he said quietly. "Something bigger." The soldiers shifted uneasily, gripping their weapons. Tighter. A sudden sound cut through the silence. From the broken walls emerged towering alien beasts, their skin covered in natural armor plates, eyes glowing with hunger. The soldiers panicked, forming a shaky line. The ambassador's voice rang out, steady and calm, ordering them to hold. But before they could react further, Kale was already moving. He charged toward the nearest beast, ducking under its massive claws and driving his blade into the joint of its leg. The creature roared, stumbling as Kale twisted the weapon free. Another beast lunged from the side, but Kale spun, using its momentum to slam it into the crumbling wall. The soldiers watched in shock as the human fought with precision and force that seemed impossible for his size. The ambassador joined the fight, her twin blades flashing in the sunlight. Together, she and Kale moved like parts of the same machine, covering each other without speaking. The beasts were strong, but they were unprepared for the relentless speed of their attackers. One by one, they fell, their armored bodies crashing to the ground. When the last beast collapsed, the courtyard was silent except for the sound of heavy breathing. The soldiers stared at Kale as if seeing him for the first time. His armor was scratched and marked, but he stood straight, his eyes scanning the area for any remaining threats. The ambassador wiped her blades clean and gave him a nod of respect. They continued deeper into the borderlands, passing through abandoned villages and burned fields. Everywhere they went, Kale searched for signs of survivors. The ambassador noticed that he moved faster when they found evidence of human presence, his eyes narrowing in focus. She realized then that his loyalty was not to the emperor, but to his own people. Yet he still followed orders, and that made him dangerous in ways the emperor could not yet see. As night fell, they made camp in the shadow of a rocky ridge. The soldiers kept their distance from Kale, speaking in hushed voices around their fires. The ambassador approached him, carrying a small flask of water. "They're afraid of you," she said. Kale took the flask, drinking slowly before handing it back. "Good," he replied. "Fear keeps them alive." The ambassador studied him for a moment before sitting beside him. "You could leave," she said softly. "You could vanish into these mountains, and the emperor would never find you." Kale glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "And leave you to deal with this war alone?" His voice was quiet but firm. "Not my style." She looked away, hiding the faint smile that touched her lips. For the first time, she understood why she had chosen him over an entire legion. The human was not just a weapon. He was a storm contained in flesh and steel. And when that storm was unleashed, nothing would stand in its path. At first light, Kale was already awake, checking his gear with methodical precision. The ambassador found him near the edge of camp, staring out over the valley below. A mist rolled through the mountains, hiding the paths they had traveled the day before. She stepped beside him, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. "You sense something," she said quietly. Kale nodded once, his voice low. "We're being followed. The soldiers stirred behind them, unaware of the danger. Kale and the ambassador exchanged a look, an unspoken agreement passing between them. Without alerting the others, they began moving toward the eastern slope, following the faint signs left by their pursuers. Broken twigs, displaced stones. The subtle drag marks of something heavy being carried. Kale moved like a hunter, silent and deliberate. Halfway down the slope, they found the source. A group of enemy scouts crouched among the rocks, their weapons trained on the sleeping camp above. They were alien mercenaries, taller than Kale, with scaled skin and long curved blades. The ambassador's hand went to her weapon, but Kale held up a hand to stop her. His eyes stayed locked on the scouts as he whispered, "We take them before they signal their army." Kale sprang forward with explosive speed, closing the distance before the scouts could react. His blade struck the first one in the chest, knocking it backward into the rocks. The ambassador was right behind him, her twin blades slicing through another's weapon arm. The fight was quick but brutal, the narrow pass echoing with the clash of steel and the sharp cries of their enemies. When it was over, the scouts lay motionless, their signal devices smashed to pieces. By the time they returned to camp, the soldiers were awake and restless. Kale gave no explanation for his absence, only ordering them to move out immediately. The ambassador noticed the uneasy glances the soldiers exchanged, but they obeyed without question. Something in Kale's voice carried the weight of command. Even without formal rank, their path took them deeper into enemy territory. Burned-out watchtowers stood like blackened skeletons against the sky. The remains of battles littered the road's broken weapons, shattered armor, and the silent forms of those who had fallen. Kale studied each scene carefully, piecing together the movements of the enemy forces. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried certainty. "They're hurting us," he said at one point, "trying to push us into a kill zone." The ambassador trusted his instincts without hesitation. She ordered a change in direction, leading the group through a narrow canyon instead of the open plains. Hours later, they emerged to find a massive enemy ambush waiting on the plain they had avoided. Hundreds of soldiers stood where they would have walked, unaware their prey had slipped past. The soldiers in Kale's group looked at him with newfound respect. That night, they camped in the shelter of a cliff. A cold wind swept through the canyon, carrying the distant sound of war drums. The ambassador sat by the fire, sharpening her blades. Kale sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the flames. "They'll keep sending more," he said. "Bigger forces, stronger ones." She met his eyes across the fire. "Then we keep moving. And we keep killing them until they have nothing left." Before dawn, the attack came. Enemy fighters swarmed over the cliffs, dropping into the camp with deadly precision. The soldiers scrambled to defend themselves, but Kale was already in motion, cutting down the first attackers before they could find their footing. The ambassador moved with him, their strikes synchronized in a deadly rhythm. The clash of weapons and the shouts of battle filled the narrow canyon. When the last enemy fell, the survivors of their group stood in stunned silence. Kale's armor was dented and marked, his breathing steady despite the ferocity of the fight. He looked over the survivors, his voice firm. "Pack up. We're moving. This place won't be safe for long." The ambassador watched him, realizing that the soldiers now looked to him before anyone else. Without even trying, he had become their leader. As they marched out of the canyon, the sun rose over the peaks, casting long shadows across the land. Kale didn't look back. He didn't need to. Every step forward meant they were closer to whatever end awaited them, and he intended to meet it standing. The ambassador kept pace beside him, her smile returning as she thought of the emperor's words. He had demanded a legion, and she had given him one man. And now that man was becoming something far greater. The mountains gave way to rolling hills covered in tall, wind-bent grass. The group moved cautiously, knowing the open terrain made them vulnerable. Kale scanned the horizon constantly, his hand never far from his weapon. The ambassador walked beside him, her sharp eyes matching his in vigilance. The soldiers behind them were quieter now, the earlier whispers replaced by a tense focus. They had begun to understand that survival depended on following Kale's lead. Without question, by midday, they spotted smoke rising from the west. Kale slowed, crouching low in the grass to study it. The ambassador joined him, her fur-lined armor brushing softly against the blades of grass. "Too thick for a campfire," she murmured. Kale nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's a village burning." "We're close to the front lines." They approached cautiously, keeping low until they reached the outskirts. The smell of ash and charred wood hung heavy in the air. The village was in ruins, its buildings blackened skeletons. Scavenger birds circled overhead, their cries echoing in the emptiness. Kale moved through the wreckage, checking for survivors. His eyes hardened when he found only lifeless forms. The ambassador's hand rested briefly on his shoulder, before she turned toward the tracks leading out of the village. The tracks told a grim story. A large force had moved through recently, taking prisoners. Kale's expression was unreadable, but the ambassador recognized the shift in his stance. He was no longer simply tracking enemies, he was hunting. Without a word, they followed the trail, moving faster as the sun began to sink behind the hills. The soldiers struggled to keep up but pushed themselves harder under Kale's silent pressure. They found the enemy encampment at dusk. Fires burned in a loose ring, casting flickering light over rows of tents. The prisoners were gathered near the center, guarded by armored figures with jagged weapons. Kale studied the layout with sharp precision, memorizing guard rotations and blind spots. The ambassador knelt beside him, her golden eyes glinting in the firelight. "We can strike when the moon is high," she whispered. Kale gave a short nod, already planning their approach. When the time came, they moved like shadows. Kale slipped past the first guard without a sound, his blade cutting swiftly before the alien could cry out. The ambassador mirrored his movements. On the opposite side, her twin blades flashing in the darkness. The soldiers followed their lead, striking with surprising coordination. The camp erupted in chaos as Kale reached the prisoners, cutting their bonds and urging them toward the edge of the camp. An enemy warlord emerged from one of the larger tents, towering over Kale. His armor was plated in black steel, and his weapon crackled with energy. The warlord roared, charging forward with a speed that belied his size. Kale met him head-on, their weapons clashing in a burst of sparks. The fight was brutal, each blow ringing out across the camp. The ambassador cut down attackers who tried to interfere, keeping Kale's back clear. When Kale finally drove his blade through the warlord's chest, the camp fell silent for a moment, before breaking into chaos again. With the warlord down, the enemy's will to fight crumbled. The soldiers and freed prisoners pushed through the remaining resistance, driving them into the darkness beyond the fires. Kale stood over the fallen warlord for a heartbeat longer before turning to lead the way out. The ambassador fell into step beside him, her smile faint but fierce. "That's twice now you've broken them," she said. Kale only grunted, scanning the path ahead. They marched through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the battlefield. By dawn, the group was exhausted, but they had all survived. The freed prisoners walked among them, whispering to each other about the human warrior who had cut down a warlord as if it were nothing. Kale ignored the words, his focus still on the land ahead. The ambassador, however, listened closely. The story was already growing, spreading like fire through dry grass. When they finally stopped to rest, the ambassador sat beside Kale on a fallen log. "You're becoming a symbol," she said. "Not just for humans, but for anyone who's tired of being crushed by the Empire." Kale shook his head slightly, his voice steady. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." The ambassador's Smile deepened as she looked toward the rising sun. That's exactly why they'll follow you. The morning sun cast a golden light over the camp, but the air remained heavy with tension. The rescued villagers huddled together, speaking in low voices. The soldiers moved quietly, repairing gear and checking weapons. Kale walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning every shadow and movement. The ambassador watched him from a distance, noticing how even without giving orders, he was directing the flow of the camp through his presence alone. As they prepared to move, a scout returned with news. An imperial force was marching toward them, and they would arrive by nightfall. The soldiers tensed at the words, but Kale's expression did not change. He turned to the ambassador. We can't outrun them with the villagers. We make our stand here. She studied him for a moment, before nodding. Then we choose the ground where we'll break them. Kale led the group to a narrow gorge nearby. Steep walls rose on both sides with only one entry point. It was the perfect place to funnel an enemy force. The soldiers began setting traps. Under Kale's direction, placing sharpened stakes, loose rocks, and hidden pits. The ambassador moved among them, lending her experience to strengthen the defenses. The villagers helped where they could, their fear tempered by the determination they saw in the human and his ally. By afternoon, the preparations were complete. Kale stood at the mouth of the gorge, his hands resting lightly on his weapons. The ambassador approached him, her golden eyes glinting. They'll come in waves, she said. We hold until they break. Kale's gaze stayed on the horizon. Or until they run. She smiled faintly, knowing he believed the second outcome was more likely. As the sun dipped low, the first enemy scouts appeared. They were cautious at first, testing the ground. When the traps claimed the first few, their leaders pushed the rest forward with shouts. The gorge echoed with the sound of battle as Kale met them head-on. His strikes were swift and decisive, each movement wasting no energy. The ambassador fought at his side, their rhythm unbroken, even as the enemy pressed harder. The narrow space worked in their favor. The enemy could not bring their full numbers to bear, and those who entered the gorge were forced into close combat. The soldiers held the line, emboldened by Kale's presence. Arrows and bolts rained down from the ridges, striking enemies who tried to climb the walls. The air filled with the clash of steel, the shouts of warriors, and the cries of the wounded. Hours passed, but the attacks did not stop. The enemy threw themselves forward again and again, only to be driven back. Kale moved like a shadow through the chaos, cutting down attackers before they could strike his allies. The ambassador's blades flashed in the fading light, her movements precise and deadly. The ground grew slit beneath their boots, but they did not falter. When the enemy finally broke, it was sudden. A shout went up from their ranks, and the survivors began to fall back in disorder. The soldiers of Kale's group cheered, but he did not relax. He watched the retreat carefully, his eyes narrowing. They'll regroup, he said quietly to the ambassador. She nodded, her expression grim. And they'll come back stronger. That night, the camp was quiet. The villagers tended to the wounded while the soldiers kept watch. Kale sat apart from the others, cleaning his weapons. The ambassador joined him, sitting on a flat stone. You keep giving them victories, she said softly. They'll start to believe they can win this war. Kale's hands did not stop moving. Belief is the first weapon they've been missing. The ambassador tilted her head, studying him. And when the emperor hears about what happened here, what will he think? Kale met her gaze, his eyes steady. That his war is changing. And that one human is the reason why. The ambassador's lips curved into a slow smile as the night wind carried the scent of smoke and steel through the gorge. In her mind, the emperor's demand for allegiance seemed smaller with each passing day, replaced by the truth she had always known. She had brought him something far more dangerous. Asterisk at dawn, the soldiers awoke to the sound of distant drums. The rhythm was slow but powerful, carrying across the valley. Kale stood at the edge of the gorge, watching the horizon as the sun broke through the mist. The ambassador joined him, her armor gleaming faintly in the early light. "They're coming," she said quietly. Kale's hand tightened on the hilt of his weapon as he nodded. The villagers were moved deeper into the hills under guard, leaving only the soldiers to hold the gorge. Kale gave clear, direct instructions, placing each fighter where they could. "Do the most damage." The ambassador moved among them, checking defenses and boosting their resolve with calm, confident words. Every soldier felt the weight of what was coming, but none showed fear in front of the human who had already led them through impossible fights. By midday, the enemy appeared in full force. Rows upon rows of warriors marched in perfect formation, their armor catching the sunlight. Behind them came massive siege beasts, each carrying heavy weapons meant to smash through stone. The ambassador's sharp gaze took in their numbers. "They've brought everything they have left in this sector," she said. Kale's jaw set firmly. "Then this is where we end them." The first wave struck hard. Siege weapons pounded the walls of the gorge while warriors charged the narrow pass. Kale was there to meet them, his blade moving with deadly precision. The ambassador fought at his side, her twin swords flashing as she cut down any who broke through. The soldiers held the line with grim determination, their movements drilled and disciplined under Kale's watch. The enemy tried to overwhelm them with numbers, sending wave after wave into the bottleneck, but the gorge worked against them. Every step forward brought them into range of arrows, traps, and the relentless steel of Kale and his allies. The sound of battle filled the air, echoing off the high stone walls. Still, the enemy did not break, their commanders pushing them forward with merciless orders. Hours into the fight, the siege beasts moved closer. Their massive claws tore into the rock, pulling themselves toward the defenders. Kale shouted for the soldiers to focus on them, knowing the beasts could smash through their defenses if they reached the front. The ambassador leapt onto a ridge, striking down from above with powerful, precise blows. Together, they brought the first beast crashing down in a cloud of dust and blood. The fall of the beast sent a ripple of uncertainty through the enemy ranks, but their leaders rallied them quickly. More poured into the gorge, forcing Kale and the soldiers to fight harder. The ground was slick with mud and blood, every step a struggle to hold position. Yet Kale never slowed, his presence a steady force that kept the line from collapsing. By late afternoon, the fighting reached its peak. The last siege beast roared as Kale drove his blade deep into its neck, ending its threat. The enemy's advance faltered, their formations breaking. The ambassador raised her voice, shouting for the defenders to push forward. The soldiers surged ahead with renewed strength, driving the enemy back step by step until they were forced to retreat beyond bow range. Silence fell over the gorge, except for the ragged breathing of the survivors. Kale stood in the center, blood streaking his armor, his eyes still scanning for threats. The ambassador approached, her voice low but filled with certainty. "They won't try again here. Not after this." Kale sheathed his weapon, his gaze drifting toward the distant hills where the villagers waited. "Then we move before they regroup." That night, the campfires burned low. The soldiers sat in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about the battle. Many glanced toward Kale, their respect for him now absolute. The ambassador sat across from him, her golden eyes catching the light of the flames. "The Emperor will hear of this," she said. "And when he does, he'll know the truth." One man stood where a legion should have been, and the enemy broke. The journey from the gorge to the Emperor's capital was long and dangerous. Kale led the group through twisting canyons and over high ridges, avoiding known patrol routes. The ambassador walked beside him, her eyes always scanning for movement. The soldiers followed without question, their trust in the human now complete. Even the rescued villagers had begun to see him as something more than just a warrior. He was their shield, On the fourth day, they reached the edge of the central plains. In the distance, the spires of the capital rose like dark spears against the sky. The ambassador slowed her pace, her tail flicking in thought. "When we arrive, the emperor will want a full account," she said. Kale kept his gaze forward. "Then he'll hear the truth. And he can decide what to do with it." They entered the city at dusk, passing under massive gates guarded by armored soldiers. The streets were crowded, the air filled with the smell of spices and the murmur of countless voices. People stopped to stare at the group, whispers spreading quickly as they recognized the ambassador. Then their eyes shifted to Kale, studying the human who walked with calm strength among them. Some looked with curiosity, others with fear. The palace gates opened without delay, and they were escorted through vast halls of stone and gold. Tapestries hung from the walls, depicting the empire's victories. The emperor awaited them in the grand throne room, seated high above on his black and gold seat. His many eyes fixed on Kale, measuring him in silence. The ambassador stepped forward, bowing slightly before speaking. "My emperor, we have returned." The emperor's voice was cold but curious. "You left with a handful of soldiers, and returned with survivors, villagers, and stories of victories. Explain." The ambassador did not hesitate. She told him of the battles they had fought, of the enemy forces broken at the gorge, and of the warlord defeated in single combat. Each detail made the whispers among the gathered court grow louder. And then she stepped aside, letting Kale speak for himself. Kale's voice was calm and steady. He spoke of the choices made, the ground chosen, and the lives saved. He did not boast of his kills or his strength. He spoke only of the necessity of each action and the cost of survival. The emperor listened without interruption, his many eyes shifting between Kale and the ambassador. When Kale finished, silence hung in the great hall. Finally, the emperor leaned forward. "You have done what I demanded of a legion with only a fraction of the numbers. You have shown me that one human in the right place can be more dangerous than an army." His words carried both respect and caution. The ambassador's golden eyes glinted with quiet satisfaction. Kale simply inclined his head, neither accepting nor rejecting the praise. But the emperor's gaze sharpened. "Understand this, human. If you choose to turn your strength against me, no wall, no army, and no world in my empire will be safe. Yet if you stand with me, there's no enemy we cannot crush." The weight of the offer hung heavy in the air. Kale's eyes met the emperor's without fear. "I will stand where I am needed, and I will not be commanded by fear." The court erupted in murmurs at his boldness, but the emperor only smiled faintly. "Then we will see where your path leads." He gestured for them to be dismissed. The ambassador walked beside Kale as they left the throne room, her expression unreadable. When they stepped into the cool evening air, she finally spoke. "You just told the most powerful ruler in the galaxy that you'll follow your own path." Kale glanced at her, a faint smile on his lips, and he respected it. "That's the only reason we're still alive." The ambassador's tail flicked once in amusement. "You may be the only human to walk out of that room with both your life and your freedom." Kale adjusted the strap on his armor and looked toward the darkening sky. "Then we'll use both wisely." The weeks after their return to the capital were tense. The emperor had not summoned Kale or the ambassador again, but his watchful presence could be felt in every corner of the city. Kale spent most of his days training in the palace yards, refusing to grow soft. The ambassador often joined him, their sparring sessions drawing curious crowds, who whispered about the human who had faced armies and lived. News of their victories spread far beyond the palace walls. Soldiers who had fought beside Kale told their stories in taverns and barracks, each retelling making him larger than life. The villagers they had saved spoke his name with gratitude, and even those who had once doubted the ambassador's choice now admitted she had been right. One man had done what entire legions had failed to do. One evening, the ambassador arrived at the training yard, carrying sealed orders. She handed them to Kale without a word. Breaking the seal, he read the Emperor's command. A new threat had risen in the outer sectors, one that even the Empire's best forces had failed to contain. The Emperor wanted Kale to lead a strike force there. The ambassador's golden eyes watched him closely. "He's testing you again," she said. Kale folded the orders calmly. "Then we'll give him his answer, the journey to the outer sectors took them through hostile territory. Enemy ships shadowed them for days before breaking off, wary of an open fight. Kale used the time to drill the soldiers under his command, sharpening their skills until they moved as one. The ambassador watched his methods with approval. He trained them not just to obey, but to think, to adapt, and to survive. It was the same way he fought. When they reached the target world, they found a landscape scarred by war. Burned forests stretched for miles, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and metal. The enemy had dug deep into the mountains, turning them into fortresses. Kale stood at the edge of a ridge, studying the terrain in silence. The ambassador stepped beside him. "You see a way in," she said. Kale nodded. "And a way to end this fast." That night, they moved under cover of darkness. Kale led a small team through narrow ravines, avoiding patrols and traps. The ambassador was at his side, her blades ready. When they reached the enemy's main gate, Kale used the element of surprise, striking with precision that shattered their defenses before an alarm could be raised. The battle inside was swift and brutal. The battle inside. Enemy unable to recover from the shock. By dawn, the fortress was theirs. The surviving enemy fighters fled into the mountains, their command structure broken. Kale stood on the walls, watching the smoke rise from the enemy stronghold. The ambassador joined him, her armor marked with fresh scars. "The Emperor will hear of this before the day is over," she said. Kale's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Good. Let him understand that he doesn't need a legion. He just needs results." When they returned to the capital, the throne room was more crowded than before. Nobles, generals, and foreign envoys had gathered to witness the audience. The Emperor listened to the report in silence, his many eyes fixed on Kale. When the ambassador finished speaking, the Emperor rose from his throne. His voice carried through the hall. "I asked for a legion, and you gave me one man. That man has brought me victory after victory. Tell me, human, what do you want in return?" Kale stood still for a moment before answering. "I want the people we saved to be free from your taxes and your soldiers. I want the villages left alone. And I want every fighter who stood with me to have a choice in their future." The hall erupted in shocked whispers, but Kale's gaze never left the Emperor's. The Emperor studied him for a long moment before nodding once. "Granted. You've earned it." The ambassador's lips curved into a slow smile as they left the hall together. Outside, the city was alive with noise, the streets crowded with people eager to see them. Kale looked out over the crowd, his voice low. "One man instead of a legion. I hope the Emperor knows he'll never own me." The ambassador glanced at him, her golden eyes shining. "I think that's why he'll keep you alive. You're not his soldier. You're his reminder of what one person can do."